Excuse me, miss. The service entrance is around back, for kitchen staff. The words slid from the young receptionist's mouth with the slick, unthinking ease of a lifetime of privilege. He didn't bother to lift his eyes from the glossy, oversized clipboard he was holding, his perfectly coiffed blonde hair catching the light of the grand chandelier in the Olympian Tower's lobby. With a flick of his wrist, he gestured vaguely toward the rear of the building, a dismissive wave that carried the casual, brutal cruelty of a man who had never once in his life had his assumptions challenged. What would you do? What would you say in that moment? Before we even dive into this story, I need you to go down to the comments and tell me what your first reaction would be. And while you're there, do me a favor and smash that like button and subscribe to the channel. Because what you are about to witness is not just a story, it's a masterclass in revenge. Aurora Vance stood perfectly still. She was a statue of composure, in a simple, elegant midnight blue dress that whispered quality rather than screaming for attention. Around her, the air itself seemed to hum with the frequency of old money. Champagne flutes clinked like tiny, cheerful bells, and the low buzz of conversation was woven from the comfortable, unshakable confidence of inherited wealth. These were the gods of Manhattan, the financial deities who moved markets and toppled governments from their sky-high penthouses, and tonight they were gathering for their most sacred ritual, the Sterling Thorn Foundation Gala. Aurora watched the receptionist meticulously arrange the embossed name tags on the mahogany desk, a pantheon of names that had built and broken this city for over a century. "I'm here for the gala," she said, her voice quiet but carrying a strange resonance that seemed to cut through the ambient noise. This time he looked up. His eyes, a shade of pale, bored blue, did a quick, dismissive scan. They swept over her once, from the simple pearl earrings to the classic cut of her dress. Then again, as if his brain needed a moment to confirm what his prejudice had already decided. "I'm sorry, but I think there's been a mistake," he said, his tone shifting from dismissive to patronizing. "This is a very exclusive event." As if on cue, a new voice, dripping with practiced condescension, joined the fray. "Is there a problem here, Dennis? We can't have any disruptions tonight, of all nights." Aurora felt the familiar weight of their collective gaze, a physical pressure. It was the unified judgment of people who measured a person's worth by the label on their suit or the antiquity of their surname, rather than the fire of their ambition or the scale of their achievements. She felt her fingers twitch, wanting to reach into the slim leather portfolio at her side to pull out the documents nestled within that could detonate the very foundations of their gilded world. But not yet. Oh, no, not yet. First, she needed to see. She needed to let them talk. She needed to see just how deep the rot went, how far they would push, how much rope they would unspool to hang themselves. She had approached the reception desk with the quiet confidence of a predator entering a new territory. The receptionist, Dennis, with his hair that looked like it had been sculpted by angels, and his eyes that measured worth in melanin content rather than merit, had been the first test. "Excuse me," she had said, her voice carrying the refined, crisp cadence of a Columbia Business School education. "I'm Aurora Vance. I'm here for the Sterling Thorn Gala." Dennis's mouth had twitched into something that was supposed to be a smile, but looked more like a sneer. "I think you might be looking for the service entrance," he'd repeated, a little louder this time, enjoying the performance. Kitchen staff should report directly to the back of the building. The casual cruelty in his tone was a weapon, honed by a lifetime spent within the world's most exclusive hierarchies, never once questioning his own lofty position within them. Aurora's expression remained a mask of serene neutrality. "I have an invitation." "An invitation?" He laughed, a short, sharp bark of a sound, brittle enough to shatter crystal. "Miss, this is a private event. Very exclusive. I'm certain there's been some sort of misunderstanding." That's when the second player had entered the stage. Cassandra Vanderbilt, wife of a real estate titan whose name was plastered on half the skyscrapers in the city, glided toward them. Her approach was measured, regal, the walk of a woman accustomed to commanding any room she entered. A rope of pearls, each the size of a marble, glowed against her skin, catching the light as she assessed Aurora with the critical, dismissive eye of an appraiser examining a piece of questionable art. "This young woman seems confused about the nature of this event," Dennis explained, his voice pitched just loud enough to snag the attention of those nearby. He was a courtier, reporting a disturbance to his queen. Cassandra's gaze sharpened, zeroing in on Aurora. "Are you with the catering company? Because if you are, you're quite late, and that attire, while sweet, is hardly appropriate for service staff." With a movement that was deliberately slow, exquisitely unhurried, Aurora reached into her portfolio. She withdrew the heavy, cream-colored invitation, the sterling thorn crest embossed in gold leaf at the top. "Aurora Vance," she said, her voice steady and clear. "Vance Capital." She extended the invitation with the same unshakable calm she would display during a hostile takeover negotiation. Cassandra accepted the card as if it might be contaminated, holding it delicately between her thumb and forefinger. She studied it with the fierce intensity of a detective examining a forged document, a piece of evidence at a crime scene. Her perfectly arched eyebrows rose a fraction of an inch. "This is highly unusual. I don't recall seeing the Vance name on our guest lists before." The words hung in the opulent air like the smoke from an expensive cigar, acrid and suffocating. Around them, the comfortable buzz of conversation began to falter. Heads started to turn. A scene was developing, a piece of unexpected theater in their otherwise predictable evening. Aurora could feel the weight of their stares, each one a tiny pinprick of judgment. A verdict delivered without a trial, based on evidence they had manufactured in their own minds. "Perhaps there has been a mistake," Cassandra continued, her voice rising slightly, playing to the gathering audience. "These invitations are for our closest associates, family connections, you understand, generational relationships that have stood the test of time." Aurora's smile never wavered, but it didn't reach her eyes. Her dark eyes were already at work, cataloging the faces in the crowd, memorizing names, calculating the precise financial and social cost of their blatant assumptions. In the silent, whirring supercomputer of her mind, she was already composing the press release, the one that would announce the end of the Thorne dynasty's century-long reign over Manhattan's financial district. Her internal clock was ticking. 20 minutes had become 15. She had a schedule to keep. The growing commotion had finally drawn the big shark from the main ballroom. Sterling Thorne IV emerged from the gilded doors like he was sensing blood in the water. His platinum cufflinks, heirlooms from his great-grandfather, caught the chandelier light as he moved. Everything about him, from his Savile Row suit to the heavy signet ring that had graced the hands of 5 generations of Thorne men, screamed old money. His pale blue eyes, the color of a winter sky, fixed on Aurora with the predatory focus of a man accustomed to identifying and crushing threats before they could fully materialize. "What seems to be the issue here?" His voice was a low baritone, accustomed to instant obedience. Cassandra Vanderbilt stepped forward, a loyal lieutenant reporting to her general. "Sterling, darling, this person claims to have an invitation to our gala. I believe there may be some sort of irregularity." Sterling's gaze moved over Aurora, a clinical detached examination, like an entomologist studying an unusual and slightly distasteful specimen. Irregularity? His laugh was a cultured, cruel puff of air. My dear Cassandra, I believe the word you're searching for is impossibility. He gestured grandly towards the ballroom, where the financial elite of Manhattan mingled beneath massive oil paintings of their dead, robber baron ancestors. Miss, he said, addressing Aurora directly for the first time. Do you have any idea what kind of event this is? These are the descendants of the families who built this country's economic foundations. Rockefellers, Carnegies. This isn't some charity function where anyone with a sob story can simply walk in off the street. Aurora's voice remained perfectly level, a weapon of professionalism against their raw prejudice. I was invited by Sterling Thorne as a key partner for the upcoming Blackwood acquisition. The silence that followed was a physical thing, a sudden vacuum in the lobby that sucked the air from everyone's lungs. Sterling's eyes narrowed to tiny, dangerous slits. Partner? The word dripped with a thick, syrupy disbelief. Young lady, I think someone has played a very cruel, very tasteless joke on you. The real financial world doesn't operate the way it does in Hollywood movies. A small, curious crowd had gathered now, a circle of exquisitely dressed vultures drawn by the novelty of a real confrontation in their carefully curated, predictable world. Aurora recognized faces from the covers of Forbes and Fortune, CEOs whose idle comments could move markets, all of them watching her like she was an exhibit in a zoo. Perhaps, Sterling continued, his voice rising, ensuring his entire audience could hear his magnanimous verdict. You should return to wherever it is you came from. This particular gathering requires a certain pedigree, a heritage that cannot be manufactured or imitated. Almost imperceptibly, a subtle movement of her finger, Aurora activated her phone's recording function. Evidence. Always collect the evidence. Dr. Alistair Finch, a pharmaceutical executive whose company was famous for price-gouging life-saving drugs, stepped forward with the confident, swaggering stride of a man riding the social wave. Sterling is being diplomatic, he announced with a smug grin. What he means to say is that this level of finance requires a generational trust, family names that have proven their mettle over decades. His smile was as sharp and cold as a surgical steel scalpel. Nothing personal, of course. It's simply a matter of institutional compatibility. Aurora nodded slowly, her expression one of deep concentration, as if she were considering his words with the utmost care. Institutional compatibility. How fascinating. Her thumb moved silently across the screen of her phone, sending a single encrypted message to her top lieutenant. Prepare the Blackwood transfer. Stand by for execution. That message, those 6 simple words, would change everything. But first, she needed to let them finish. She needed to see just how deep their prejudice ran, just how much rope they would gleefully use to hang themselves. The crowd thickened, closing in around them like blood cells responding to a foreign contagion. Aurora found herself at the very center of a circle that felt less like a social gathering and more like a tribunal, a kangaroo court where her guilt had already been decided. Sterling Thorne IV stood before her like a judge preparing to deliver a sentence, the full weight of his family's century of financial dominance giving gravity to every syllable he uttered. I think, Sterling announced, his voice booming with the unshakable authority of a man who had never been denied anything in his entire life. We need to address this situation directly. He turned, a master showman, to the growing audience of New York's financial royalty. Ladies and gentlemen, we seem to have an individual here who believes, against all evidence, that she belongs in our world. A wave of nervous, tittering laughter rippled through the crowd. It was the sound of relief, the collective exhale of a group reaffirming their own exclusivity. Aurora stood perfectly still, her dark eyes moving deliberately from face to face, a silent camera recording each smug expression, each condescending smirk, each glint of superiority. She was building her case, gathering evidence for a trial that would not be decided in a courtroom, but in the unforgiving arena of the stock market. Just then, the crowd parted like the Red Sea. Beatrice Thorne emerged from the ballroom like a grand dame making her entrance at the opera. At 75, she remained the indomitable, iron-willed backbone of Manhattan's most powerful financial dynasty. Her silver hair was coiffed into a regal style that hadn't changed since the Nixon administration, and her pale blue eyes, a shade colder than her son's, held the chilling authority of someone who had spent 5 decades deciding who belonged in which rooms and who did not. Sterling. Her voice was as crisp and brittle as autumn leaves. What is all this commotion? We have important guests waiting. Sterling straightened his posture, instantly transforming from a judge into a subordinate soldier reporting to his commanding officer. Mother, this person, she claims to have been invited to our gala. She says she's some kind of financial partner. Beatrice's glacial gaze fell upon Aurora, carrying with it the weight of historical judgment. Financial partner? Her laugh was a cascade of tiny, shattering icicles. My dear girl, do you have any conception of what that term truly means? The Thorne name has graced Wall Street since before the Federal Reserve even existed. We don't simply partner with anyone. She glided closer, her expensive perfume enveloping them in a cloud of jasmine and condescension. Her voice dropped to a stage whisper, a conspiratorial tone that somehow, magically, carried to every corner of the lobby. This is not a diversity initiative, you understand? This is not some corporate charity event. This is where real money, generational wealth, makes real decisions. I'm afraid you've stumbled into the wrong party, dear. The crowd murmured its quiet approval, a Greek chorus endorsing their queen's pronouncement. Aurora absorbed every insult, every assumption, every casual, cruel dismissal of her very existence in their world. But beneath her placid exterior, a storm of calculations was raging, moves and countermoves, strategic decisions clicking into place with the cold, hard logic of a chess grandmaster. Her phone vibrated silently against her palm. A new message from her lieutenant. Blackwood confirmed. $1, $2 billion transfer is locked and loaded. Awaiting your signal. Aurora's thumb hovered over the send button. Not yet. Let them dig just a little deeper. Let them fully, irrevocably commit to their prejudice before she showed them the catastrophic cost of their assumptions. Perhaps, Dr. Finch suggested with a tone of mock helpfulness, security could escort this young woman out. Gently, of course. We wouldn't want any unpleasantness. Sterling nodded, his relief palpable. An excellent suggestion, Alistair. This has gone on long enough. Finally, Aurora spoke again. Her voice, calm and measured, sliced through their self-congratulatory murmurs like a diamond blade through silk. Before you do something that you will regret for the rest of your professional lives, she said, pausing, letting the silence stretch and build, I have one question for you. She let her gaze linger on Sterling, then on Beatrice, then sweep across the assembled crowd. How familiar are you with Vance Capital? The question landed like a stone, dropped into a perfectly still pond, sending ripples of uncertainty through the assembled guests. Sterling's armor of absolute confidence wavered, just for a fraction of a second, before he reasserted it. Never heard of it, he scoffed. Some small-time firm, I imagine? Aurora's smile was sudden, radiant, and absolutely devastating. Small-time firm, she mused. Yes, I suppose that's one way to describe the single largest private equity firm on the entire East Coast. The first real crack appeared in Sterling's carefully constructed facade of certainty. But he was in too deep now, pushed forward by decades of unquestioned privilege and the dozens of expectant eyes of his peers. "The largest?" he began, his voice laced with disbelief, but he was cut short. His phone was buzzing, an insistent, angry vibration in his jacket pocket. He ignored it. The device continued its urgent, relentless summons. "I think," Aurora said, her voice now a soft, dangerous purr. "You might want to take that call." The escalation began not with a bang, but with the subtle, terrifying shift in crowd dynamics, like the moment just before an avalanche when the first few stones begin their unstoppable descent. Sterling Thorne's phone continued its frantic buzzing, a desperate alarm he was determined to ignore. His pride, a force more powerful than any market trend, demanded it. He stood before Aurora like a gladiator in the center of the Colosseum, blissfully unaware that the lions had already been unchained and were stalking toward him. "Miss, Carter, was it?" he said, deliberately getting her name wrong, his voice carrying the practiced, weary condescension of a man who had spent his entire life looking down on others, both literally and figuratively. "I don't know what little game you're playing, but this charade has reached its conclusion." That was level 1 of the escalation. The direct, personal assault. He stepped closer, deliberately invading her personal space, an aggressive act of dominance from someone who had never once feared real consequences for his actions. "Do you have any idea who you're talking to? My family has been managing wealth in this city since before your great-grandparents were even—" He caught himself, but the vile implication hung in the thick, opulent air, like toxic smoke. Aurora's expression remained utterly impassive, a mask of stone. "Please, continue, Mr. Thorne. I'm finding your family history utterly fascinating." "What Sterling means," Dr. Alistair Finch interjected smoothly, moving to flank Aurora in a coordinated pincer movement, "is that this industry, at its highest levels, requires a certain cultural understanding, a shared context. It's built on generational connections, on a trust that's been carefully cultivated over decades between families who understand each other." The dog whistle wasn't just a whistle. It was a deafening siren that only they could pretend not to hear. Aurora's phone buzzed again in her hand. A new message. Thorne Industries stock down 3% in after-hours trading on rumors of Blackwood acquisition instability. Perfect timing for transfer. Level 2 of the escalation began, the crowd joining the feast. Cassandra Vanderbilt, emboldened by the alpha male support, stepped forward again. "I think we're all being remarkably patient here," she announced, her voice dripping with faux concern. "But this is becoming genuinely disruptive to the actual invited guests." "Disruptive," echoed Robert Sterling, a hedge fund manager whose entire portfolio was built on a series of insider trades that had somehow, miraculously, never quite crossed the line into illegality. "That's precisely the word for it. Some people simply don't understand the concept of appropriate boundaries. Are you feeling that rage building up? Can you imagine the sheer force of will it took for her not to lose her cool? If you are loving this story, hit that like button right now. Let the algorithm know that we want more stories of epic takedowns like this." More voices now joined the swelling chorus, each one adding their own unique note to the growing symphony of exclusion and prejudice. Aurora stood at the center of it all, a pillar of calm in the swirling eye of a hurricane she had summoned herself. She was no longer just observing. She was counting. Counting the voices, memorizing the faces, calculating the collective net worth of the entitled prejudice that was surrounding her. It was a staggering sum. "Perhaps," suggested Victoria Ashford, the wife of an oil dynasty heir, her voice a delicate whisper. We should be asking how she even obtained an invitation in the first place, because legitimate channels would simply never— What Victoria is so delicately trying to say, Sterling interrupted, his voice rising again, taking command, addressing the entire lobby as his personal stage, is that certain standards exist for a reason. They are the bedrock of our world. Not everyone can simply declare themselves a part of it. Level 3. The complete and utter loss of control. The confrontation had now drawn nearly every single guest from the grand ballroom. The titans of Manhattan's financial world formed concentric circles around the unfolding drama, their conversations about mergers and markets completely forgotten in favor of the far more titillating spectacle of Aurora's public humiliation. She had become their evening's blood sport. Sterling's phone buzzed again. This time he couldn't ignore it, as the panicked, sweat-sheened face of his top assistant appeared on the screen via a video call. Sir, I am so sorry to interrupt, but we have an emergency situation with the Blackwood— Sterling declined the call with an angry, dismissive swipe of his thumb. Whatever it is can wait. We're dealing with a security situation here. Aurora's smile widened, a subtle, almost imperceptible shift at the corners of her mouth. A security situation? How very dramatic. Mock this all you want, young woman, Beatrice Thorne declared, her voice ringing with the absolute authority of a woman who had shaped Manhattan society for 5 long decades. But actions have consequences, and the action of crashing our private event will have very, very serious consequences indeed. She turned and gestured towards the team of hotel security guards that had materialized at the edge of the lobby. They were large men in sharp suits, their professionalism a thin veneer over an unmistakable air of menace. Gentlemen, please escort this individual from the premises. Use whatever discretion is necessary. The security team moved forward as one, a synchronized machine of quiet intimidation. The crowd watched, their eyes wide with the cruel fascination of ancient Romans in the Colosseum, witnessing the final moments of a gladiator about to be devoured. Aurora raised her hand, not in a gesture of surrender, but of command, and somehow that simple gesture carried more intrinsic authority than all of Beatrice Thorne's imperious commands combined. The security team stopped in their tracks. Before you make what I absolutely promise you will be the single most expensive mistake of your entire lives, she said, her voice cutting through the murmurs like a conductor's baton, commanding an instant, sharp silence. I have one more question for you. She turned her head slowly, her dark, piercing eyes locking onto Sterling's pale blue ones with a laser-like intensity. The Blackwood acquisition, she said, her voice dropping slightly, forcing them to lean in. The $1.2 billion deal. Your family's largest, most important deal in 3 generations. The one that's supposed to cement Thorne Industries' dominance for the next century. She paused, letting the weight of the words sink in, letting them feel the gravity of what she was talking about. How confident are you right now, in this exact moment, that it is proceeding as planned? Sterling's face went white. It wasn't a gradual change. It was instantaneous, as if someone had pulled a plug and drained all the blood from his features. Around him, the expressions of the crowd began to shift, a rapid evolution from smug amusement to confusion, and then to the first cold whispers of alarm. His phone buzzed again, a frantic, desperate vibration. This time he answered it, his fingers trembling so badly he almost dropped the device. Sir! His assistant's voice was a high-pitched, panicked squeak, perfectly audible in the sudden, tomb-like silence of the lobby. Sir, Vance Capital has just withdrawn from the Blackwood acquisition. They're transferring the entire $1.2 billion portfolio to Northgate Partners. Sir, the deal is dead. The Thorne-Blackwood deal is dead. In that single, breathtaking moment, The tectonic plates of Manhattan's financial world shifted in real time. A seismic event visible in the collective, horrified intake of breath from 200 of the city's most powerful people. Aurora Vance stood at the absolute epicenter of an earthquake she had engineered with the surgical precision of a master demolitions expert. Sterling Thorne's phone slipped from his nerveless, numb fingers, clattering onto the Italian marble floor with a sharp, cracking sound, like breaking glass. The screen, miraculously intact, lit up with a cascade of notifications. 17 missed calls from board members, a dozen frantic texts from his legal team, and a flood of alerts from financial news outlets. The Thorne empire wasn't just in trouble. It was hemorrhaging credibility and capital in real time, and everyone in this room was a witness. That's impossible," Sterling whispered, his voice a hoarse, strangled sound, barely audible above the crowd's growing, panicked murmur. "The merger was locked. The contracts were signed. We had guarantees." "No," Aurora corrected, her voice carrying the calm, unshakable authority of someone who didn't just play the game, but who now owned the entire board. "You had assumptions." She let that word hang in the air for a moment, a poisoned dart. "You assumed Vance Capital was a small, insignificant firm. You assumed I was someone you could dismiss, someone you could insult, someone who didn't belong. You assumed your family name, your precious pedigree, carried more weight than actual, tangible financial power." She reached into her portfolio one last time and withdrew a simple, elegant business card. It was devastating in its simplicity. Aurora Vance, founder and CEO, Vance Capital. She presented it to the stunned crowd as if revealing the winning hand in a high-stakes poker game. "The third largest investment firm on the East Coast, as I believe I mentioned earlier. Also, as of approximately 15 minutes ago, the company that just transferred $1.2 billion of vital acquisition capital away from Thorne Industries and directly into the hands of your primary competitor." The revelation hit the crowd like a physical shockwave. These people, these titans of finance who moved billions with a single phone call and reshaped entire economies with a handshake, stood frozen in a state of collective catatonic shock. The impossible had just become the inevitable, and they had been given front-row seats to the execution. Beatrice Thorne seemed to age 10 years in 10 seconds. The formidable matriarch who had ruled Manhattan society with an iron fist for half a century suddenly looked fragile, brittle, like an antique porcelain vase that had been violently shaken by an earthquake. $1.2 billion, she repeated, the words barely escaping her lips, tasting like ash. "The largest single capital transfer in Thorne Industries history," Aurora confirmed, her voice devoid of triumph, stating it as a simple, undeniable fact. "Gone. Transferred to Northgate Partners, who, I must say, were quite grateful for the unexpected opportunity to expand their portfolio so dramatically." Sterling tried to speak. His mouth opened and closed, his jaw working silently, like a fish gasping for air on the deck of a boat. The man who had spent his entire life as a prince of Manhattan's financial royalty, the heir apparent to a modern-day throne, found himself utterly, completely speechless in the face of true, earned power. Dr. Finch took a slow step backward, then another, as if trying to distance himself from the radioactive fallout. His own pharmaceutical fortune, once a source of immense pride, suddenly felt pitifully small, insignificant compared to the raw power he had just witnessed. Cassandra Vanderbilt's magnificent pearl necklace seemed to tighten around her throat as the horrifying realization dawned that she had not just insulted a guest. She had been a gleeful participant in a financial massacre. But how? Robert Sterling, the hedge fund manager, managed to stammer, his mind struggling to process the logistics of the catastrophe. "The contracts, the legal frameworks, the regulatory approvals, were all contingent on Vance Capital's continued participation and financing, Aurora explained, her tone now carrying the cool, detached patience of a professor lecturing a class of particularly slow students. A participation which, as of precisely 22 minutes ago, was officially and irrevocably withdrawn. She held up her phone, the screen showing the timestamp of her encrypted message to Northgate Partners. "The true beauty of modern finance," she said, addressing the entire stunned assembly, "is the speed at which fortunes can change. A single text message, a single coded command, and a century of generational wealth becomes a generational cautionary tale." The grand lobby of the Olympian Tower had been transformed. It was no longer a party. It was a crime scene. And Aurora Vance was both the lead detective, coolly revealing the details of the murder, and the brilliant, invisible killer who had committed it. The Thorne dynasty lay bleeding out on the polished Italian marble, and Manhattan's elite, its friends and allies, could only watch in stunned, horrified silence. Sterling's assistant called again. The phone's shrill ring cut through the funereal silence like a tolling bell. This time Sterling couldn't even bring himself to look at it, let alone answer. The crushing weight of what had just happened, what he had just witnessed, what he, through his own blind, arrogant prejudice, had just caused, was settling on his shoulders like a lead blanket, suffocating him. Aurora surveyed the faces around her, her gaze moving from one to the next, reading the dawning terror in the eyes of each person who had watched her humiliation with such obvious, smug pleasure just minutes before. Now they looked at her with something approaching primal fear. They were realizing, all at once, that they had not just witnessed a business deal collapse. They had witnessed the birth of a new god in their carefully controlled pantheon, and she was not a benevolent one. "The interesting thing about assumptions," she continued, her voice carrying effortlessly to every corner of the now silent lobby, "is how astonishingly expensive they can become when they are proven to be wrong." The reckoning had only just begun. Within 30 minutes, the destruction was not only complete, it was publicly visible. Sterling Thornthorpe sat slumped in a plush leather chair that now felt like an electric chair, his face illuminated by the hellish glow of his laptop screen. He was watching his family's century-long financial empire collapse in real time. The screen was a waterfall of cascading red numbers as Thorne Industries stock plummeted in after-hours trading. Down 15%, down 20%, down 25%. News of the Vance Capital withdrawal had leaked to the financial media with the speed of light traveling through fiber optic cables. CNBC was already running a breaking news banner across the bottom of the screen. Thorne-Blackwood merger collapses as mystery firm pulls $1. To be in funding. Bloomberg terminal screens all across Manhattan were painting the exact same grim picture of total financial devastation. Beatrice Thorne stood stiffly behind her son's chair, a defeated general watching her armies being routed from a battlefield that had seemed so secure, so easily won just an hour before. Her cold blue eyes, which had sparkled with cruel amusement during Aurora's public ordeal, now held the hollow, vacant look of someone watching their entire legacy crumble into dust in real time. "How did we not know?" she whispered, her voice carrying the utter bewilderment of a monarch whose vast network of spies and informants had just proven to be catastrophically, fatally inadequate. "Vance Capital manages hundreds of billions of dollars. How in God's name did we not know who she was?" Sterling couldn't answer. He had no answer. The question itself revealed the profound depth of their insulated bubble, the suffocating completeness of their isolation from any reality that didn't perfectly reflect their own deeply ingrained assumptions. They had been so certain of their own inherent superiority that they had never bothered to do the most basic due diligence on the very person whose money, whose power, was the linchpin of their entire future. Aurora had not left the lobby. She had no intention of leaving. She stood near the reception desk, where the evening's humiliation had begun, now accepting a steady stream of phone calls from reporters who, through their own mysterious channels, already knew that she had been present for the public immolation of the Thorne family. "Ms. Vance," a tentative voice called her name from across the lobby. It was Dr. Alistair Finch. He approached her with the slow, careful steps of a man navigating a live minefield. The smug pharmaceutical executive, who had been so confident, so eager to explain the nuances of institutional compatibility, now looked like a man willingly approaching his own firing squad. "Dr. Finch," Aurora acknowledged, her tone radiating a crisp, professional courtesy that somehow felt more cutting, more insulting than any profanity could have been. I think," he stammered, his usual eloquence gone, "I think there may have been some misunderstandings here tonight." His voice carried the desperate, pleading tone of someone trying to defuse a bomb that had already detonated, leaving nothing but a crater behind. "Perhaps we could discuss this privately. You know, clear the air, find some common ground." Aurora's smile was a radiant and terrifying thing to behold. "Oh, Dr. Finch, the air is perfectly clear now. Crystal clear, in fact." She gestured with her head toward Sterling, who was still staring at his laptop screen, as if he could will the plunging red lines to reverse course through sheer force of denial. "Your friend Sterling over there is learning a valuable, if overdue, lesson. The financial world is far more meritocratic than he ever assumed. Generational wealth means absolutely nothing when generational assumptions prove to be catastrophically, ruinously wrong." Cassandra Vanderbilt approached next, her movements stiff, her face a mask of desperate courage. She was a woman who had just realized, with chilling certainty, that she had grievously insulted the single most powerful person in the room. Her pearls seemed to glow with a sickly light as she attempted what might have been intended as an apologetic smile. "Ms. Vance, I feel we all got off on the wrong foot tonight. A terrible misunderstanding. Perhaps we could start over? Fresh beginnings, you know. A clean slate." "A clean slate," Aurora repeated, her voice thoughtful, as if she were seriously considering the proposition. "How interesting. Because the slate was never dirty, Mrs. Vanderbilt. The slate was always clean. You and your friends simply chose to write your ugly, baseless assumptions all over it instead of bothering to read the facts." The crowd that had gathered so eagerly to watch Aurora's humiliation now found themselves unwitting witnesses to something far more rare and historically significant: the real-time dismantling of Manhattan's entrenched financial aristocracy. They watched like a team of anthropologists observing the sudden, inexplicable collapse of a previously unstudied and thought to be invincible civilization. Sterling's phone rang again. This time he answered it, his voice barely a recognizable croak as he spoke with what was clearly another panicked board member. "Yes, I understand. No, I do not think we can recover the Vance portfolio. No, I don't know if we can salvage the relationship with Blackwood now. No, I don't know what happens next." He ended the call and finally looked up, his eyes meeting Aurora's across the lobby. He wore the expression of a man who has just realized that he is not just outmatched, but is playing an entirely different and much simpler game. "The board," he said, his voice flat and dead, "is calling an emergency meeting for tomorrow morning. They want to discuss leadership changes." Aurora nodded with the detached professional sympathy of a surgeon explaining a terminal diagnosis to a patient's family. "I imagine they do. A $1.2 billion fiduciary failure represents a rather significant lapse in judgment, the kind that typically results in very permanent personnel adjustments." Miss Vance." It was Beatrice Thorne. Her voice, though strained, cut through the conversation with the last tattered reserves of her once unquestionable authority. "Surely we can reach some accommodation, an arrangement. Business is business, after all, personal feelings aside." Aurora turned slowly to face the matriarch who had orchestrated her public shaming with such obvious, malicious pleasure. "Business is business," she agreed, her voice as cold and hard as the marble beneath their feet. "And the business reality is that your family just provided a masterclass demonstration of why inherited power is no match for earned competence." She held up her phone, the screen alive with a flood of congratulatory messages from competitors, reporters, and investment partners. "Northgate Partners is very grateful for their expanded portfolio. Blackwood is very interested in maintaining their relationship with Vance Capital, without Thorne Industries as a middleman. And the Wall Street Journal," she said, her eyes glinting, "is very, very interested in speaking with me about the specific events of tonight." The final, brutal nail in the coffin arrived in the form of a young woman in her late 20s, approaching the shell-shocked group with the confident, brisk stride of someone carrying important news. "Mr. Thorne, I'm Sarah Chen from the Wall Street Journal. I understand you were present when Ms. Aurora Vance of Vance Capital withdrew from your acquisition deal tonight. Would you care to comment on the specific circumstances that led to this unprecedented decision?" Sterling looked at the young reporter as if she were speaking a foreign language. How could he possibly explain? How could he put into words that his family's financial empire, a dynasty a century in the making, had just collapsed because they had assumed, with absolute certainty, that a black woman couldn't possibly belong in their world? Aurora stepped forward, moving with the effortless grace of someone entirely comfortable with media attention. "Miss Chen," she said, her voice clear and strong, "I'd be happy to provide some context for tonight's business decisions." And with those simple words, the narrative shifted, permanently and irrevocably. This was no longer a story about the Thorne family's unfortunate business setback. It was now, and would forever be, the story of Aurora Vance's brilliant business triumph, and the breathtakingly arrogant assumptions that had made it both necessary and inevitable. The reckoning was complete. The revolution had not just been televised, it had been live-streamed to the entire financial world. 7 days later, Aurora Vance stood before a wall of cameras in the main conference room of Vance Capital, 60 floors above Madison Avenue. Bright morning sunlight streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows, illuminating the countless awards and accolades that lined the walls, silent testaments to a career built on relentless competence rather than inherited connections. The press conference had been officially scheduled to address recent market developments, but every single person in that room knew they were witnessing something far more significant. The global financial press had spent the entire week dissecting the stunning collapse of Thorne Industries, and Aurora's name had become synonymous with a new, disruptive kind of power in Manhattan's ossified old money establishment. "The events at the Olympian Tower last week," she began, her voice imbued with the calm, unshakable authority that had already become her trademark, were not about personal revenge. They were not about individual grievances. They were about a fundamental, existential question that our entire industry must finally answer. Are we building a financial system based on merit, or are we content to perpetuate a system based on prejudice? The room was utterly silent, save for the soft whir of cameras and the occasional rustle of a reporter's notebook. Veteran financial journalists who had covered mergers and acquisitions for decades found themselves documenting something entirely unprecedented: the real-time, visible evolution of Wall Street's power structure. "When I walked into that lobby," she continued, "I was not seen as Aurora Vance, the CEO of one of the largest investment firms on the East Coast. I was seen, simply, as a black woman in a space where black women are assumed not to belong. That distinction, that simple, baseless assumption, cost the Thorne family $1.2 billion and their century-old reputation. But more importantly, it revealed the true, hidden cost of our industry's pervasive, unconscious biases. She paused, letting the full weight of her words settle over the assembled press corps. The financial sector manages trillions of dollars in global assets. We make decisions that affect the pension funds of teachers, the university endowments of students, and the retirement savings of millions of ordinary people. Can we truly afford to make those monumental decisions through the clouded, distorted lens of inherited prejudice? A reporter from Bloomberg raised her hand. Ms. Vance, critics have suggested that your withdrawal from the Thorne-Blackwood deal was a disproportionate response to the offense. How do you respond to accusations that you destroyed a century-old family business over what some have characterized as mere social awkwardness? Aurora's smile was patient, but it held a devastating edge. Social awkwardness suggests an accidental behavior. What occurred at the Olympian Tower was systematic, intentional exclusion based on deeply ingrained racial and social assumptions. The Thorne family and their associates did not accidentally mistake me for service staff. They systematically refused to even entertain the possibility that a black woman could occupy their economic stratum. She gestured toward the panoramic windows overlooking Manhattan's financial district. Every building you see out there represents decisions made for generations by people who look exactly like the Thornes, white, male, and generationally wealthy. The result has been an industry that consistently underperforms on every meaningful diversity benchmark and systematically excludes countless qualified professionals based on their demographics rather than their competence. The $1.2 billion withdrawal wasn't a punishment, she declared, her voice rising with passion. It was a market correction. It was capital flowing away from institutional prejudice and toward institutional competence. Northgate Partners welcomed our portfolio because they evaluated our firm based on our performance metrics, not on their outdated assumptions about who belongs in their boardroom. Another reporter, this one from the Wall Street Journal, leaned forward into his microphone. What message are you trying to send to other minority professionals in finance who may have faced similar experiences? Aurora's expression softened almost imperceptibly. The hard steel in her voice gave way to something warmer, more personal. The message is simple. Do not wait for permission to occupy the spaces where you belong. Build your own rooms. Design your own tables. And when you are in a position of power, ensure those rooms have open doors, not gatekeepers. Vance Capital has always prioritized diversity in our hiring and our partnership decisions. Not because it's politically correct, but because it is economically efficient. Diverse teams make better, more robust decisions. Inclusive cultures attract and retain superior talent. The data on this is unequivocal and overwhelming. She looked directly into the main camera, as if speaking to thousands of young professionals watching around the world. For those young people who see themselves in my experience, and I know, unfortunately, that there are many, understand this. Your competence is your greatest weapon. Build it, sharpen it, use it, and when people mistake your presence for an error, show them, in no uncertain terms, the true cost of their assumptions. The conference room had become a church, and Aurora was delivering a sermon that would be quoted in business schools and boardrooms for decades to come. But she wasn't finished. Finally, she said, her voice ringing with finality, to the institutions that continue to operate under the archaic assumption that power, wealth, and influence have a particular appearance, a particular gender, or a particular skin color, I have a simple message: evolve or become extinct. The financial markets, in the long term, are ruthlessly meritocratic. The companies that embrace actual, meaningful diversity will outperform those that simply pay lip service to the appearance of it. And the companies that actively exclude qualified professionals will eventually find their capital flowing to competitors who don't. She stood, signaling the conference was over. The Olympian Tower incident was not an isolated event. It was a mirror reflecting the deep, systemic problems that exist throughout our industry. The only question now is whether our institutions will have the courage to look into that mirror and change what they see, or whether they will follow the Thorne family's example into well-deserved irrelevance. As the reporters filed out, their minds racing to file their stories, Aurora remained at the window, looking down at the city, at the financial district that had finally, grudgingly, been forced to acknowledge her power. Her phone was buzzing non-stop with messages from politicians, Fortune 500 CEOs, and university presidents, all requesting meetings, partnerships, and consultations. The revolution wasn't just televised, it was profitable, and it was just getting started. And that, my friends, is how you don't just win the game, you change the rules for everyone. What did you think of Aurora's final move at that press conference? Was it justice? Was it just good business? Let me know your thoughts down in the comments. And please don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and hit that notification bell so you never miss another story of epic justice. Until next time.